Welcome to the Into the Deep session. Tonight, Into the Deep is a freely monthly series of talks, lectures, and experiences for seeking disciples. My name is Sister Angela Marie Castellani, and I'm a Franciscan Sister of the Eucharist and the coordinator of adult faith formation and catechesis for the Archdiocese of Vancouver. And with me tonight is Clay Emo, the co-director of the Ministries and Outreach Office of the Archdiocese. And we'll welcome all of you. And tonight our speaker is Dr. Lynda Robitaille. Dr. Lynda Robitaille holds a doctorate in canon law from the Gregorian University in Rome. And she has worked in marriage tribunal ministry since 1984 in different roles as a secretary, auditor, advocate, defender of the bond, or judge. Lynda has also been teaching canon law since 1993, first at St. Paul's University in Ottawa, and most recently at St. Mark's College and Seattle University. Lynda is a specialist in marriage and procedural law and jurisprudence. She also writes on the laity and ministry. She has been working as Dean of Academic Program at St. Mark's College since 2013. She and her husband, Ilmer Pablo, and their 3 children live in North Vancouver and are parishioners of one of our parishes, St. Pius X Parish. Her topic tonight is marriage and annulment. So the meaning of marriage, the Catholic teachings on marriage and annulment. There can be so much confusion and misunderstanding about the process of annulment, the differences between annulment and divorce, the work of the marriage tribunal, and the sacramental life of our brothers and sisters who are divorced. In her presentation, Dr. Robitaille will review the Catholic teachings on marriage and the basic ideas behind church law, that is truly to promote the spiritual well-being of our faithful. She will explain the process of annulment, underlying the importance of a legal process that is also, though, a healing process, and answer some common questions that are often asked as, what happens when a marriage breaks down, and is an annulment just like a Catholic divorce? Dr. Robitaille tonight will divide her talk in 3 different parts, at the end of which she will take questions. So please ask your questions through the Q&A box that you find at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to address as many questions as possible. So at the end of each part, she will take a few minutes of questions and then again begin her talk. And then at the end, if there are questions and time allows, we'll address those questions also. So I'd like to begin with a prayer and then pass on to Lynda for the rest of the evening. So let's pray together in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. God, our Father, in your divine plan, you inspired St. Helen to search for the Holy Cross. Your grace made her capable of accepting the many difficulties in life. In order to follow Jesus Christ, your Son, I too must carry my cross daily with humility. With her prayers and protection, grant me the strength to carry my particular burden. Through the intercession of St. Helen, allow me to find time to reach out to others in moments of their needs. With the Holy Spirit as my advocate, console me in moments of difficulties, and grant me the joy and peace of mind, so that I can glorify your name forever. Amen. St. Helen, patron of all divorced, pray for us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Brothers and sisters, here is Dr. Robitaille for you. Welcome, Lynda.
Thank you. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. And I look forward to having a conversation with me. As Sister said, I will speak in 3 sections, and we'll have time to talk after each of the sections. I'm going to share my screen and talk from the PowerPoint and then come back at different times for the questions. So as Sister Angela Marie said, we're going to talk this evening about marriage, then separation and divorce, and then annulment. You'll notice I've got annulment in quotation marks, and you'll see why as we go along. I'll just repeat a little bit of what Sister Angela Marie said about me. I'm a canon lawyer. I work with the law of the Catholic Church. This means I'm going to speak about marriage, divorce, and annulment in light of the law of the Church. I will be speaking of the laws, which are called canons, and I will be referring to the 1983 Code of Canon Law. Sometimes it's going to sound a little bit jargony, but don't worry, we can always, I will try not to make it too jargony. I have worked in marriage law for many, many, many years, since 1984 originally, when I started working in the tribunal, and I've taught since 1993, most recently at St. Mark's College. Tonight we're going to talk about what is marriage. That's how we're going to start. And we're going to think about marriage in light of how Canadian society thinks about marriage and how the Catholic Church thinks about marriage. Then we'll move on to separation and divorce. What do those mean for marriage? And then we'll talk about what is an annulment. The word annulment is a popular word, but it isn't a technical word. Technically, the tribunal speaks about giving a declaration of nullity or invalidity of marriage. But we do colloquially speak of annulments. As we've said, we'll break up the questions. Oh dear, that's not what I meant to do. We'll break up the questions after each one of the sections. So it'll be easier than having to remember all your questions. To start, let's think about, why does this matter? Who is here tonight? I hope all sorts of people are here tonight. People who are just interested. We've all experienced marriage. We all know people who are separated and divorced. We ourselves might have been separated and divorced. We all know people who are in troubled marriages. As a Catholic community, it's important to know, what does the Church teach? So we can be a listening ear for people. So we can know where to send people for the proper information. There are misunderstandings about what it means for Catholics and for non-Catholics to be separated and divorced. I hope tonight we can clear up some of those misunderstandings. So thinking about marriage, when we think about the sacrament of marriage, it is different from all the other sacraments in the sense that it is not just a sacramental reality. Marriage is not just for the Roman Catholic Church. It's not always a sacrament. Marriage exists among all peoples in all religions. And it also exists civilly. Most civil jurisdictions legislate marriage just as the Church legislates marriage. So there's going to be an overlap of what do the civil jurisdictions say about marriage and what does the Catholic Church say about marriage. And sometimes our misunderstandings come from that overlap. From the Church's perspective, the Church teaches that God created marriage for all peoples and for all times. And so as the Church has tried to understand what is marriage, it has come to an understanding of what God intended for marriage, not just for Catholics, not just for Christians, but what does marriage mean for everybody? And so the Church's view of marriage is going to be looking at everybody's marriage from the perspective of what the Church believes that God has shown us about what marriage is. What sometimes makes a disconnect is that people who are not Christian, people who are not Catholic, might have a completely different understanding about marriage. So we use the same word, marriage, sometimes to talk about two distinct realities. But when we're talking about the Catholic understanding of marriage, we have to remember that we're talking about how the Catholic Church sees everybody's marriages, whether they see it that way or not. I was hoping in this slide to think about comparing what is marriage for the Church and what is marriage in Canadian society. For the most part, it's very similar, but there are some differences. So In Canadian society today, marriage is between two people. It could be between a man and a woman. It could be between two men. It could be between two women. In the eyes of the church, through the lens of the church, it's between a man and a woman. Again, remember, this is how the church thinks that God thinks about marriage, that God has taught us what marriage is. Both for Canadian society and for the church, it is a partnership of equal people. The two parties are equals. There's not a more important and a less important person. And that's similar in Canadian society. For the church, marriage is a faithful commitment. It's a commitment between two people. This is also true in Canadian society. It is between two people. Some I've written can be faithful because you could have a marriage of people who think that fidelity is not important in their marriage, and they could have a sexually open marriage. In the church, that would not be appropriate. A very important thing about marriage, teaching about marriage, is that it is lifelong. Other ways of thinking about that are that it is a permanent relationship. It is indissoluble. In civil society, yes, it can be lifelong. There's no question that people promise that. But in civil society, divorce is accepted as ending that lifelong bond. It's open to children, it's open to new life in both civil society and in the church, and also it carries with it the obligation of upbringing the child. The next two are not that they're not there in civil society, but they're very clearly explicit in the church, is that marriage is for the good of both parties. They enter it for the good of each other. And sometimes in the church, marriage is a sacrament. Not always, and we're going to talk about that. So I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago that the church teaches what marriage is from the church's own understanding of what we have learned about marriage. There are different laws or different ways of thinking about how we learn about marriage. We learn about marriage from the divine law, from the Word of God. What did God tell us explicitly about marriage? And in the Bible, we have some very explicit things. We also know about marriage through natural law, through the law that is written in our hearts. And the church also interprets that law for its understanding of marriage. On top of those things, there are some laws in the church that are there just for the good of the church community, just for the good of baptized Catholics, for the well-being, the well-running of our community. These laws are called ecclesiastical laws. And we're going to talk about those also. The ecclesiastical law most of us would have come in contact with is the law of the form of marriage, that Catholics are obliged to marry in a Catholic ceremony. It applies only to Catholics because it was enacted by the church for the good of Catholics. And so it doesn't apply to other people. So when we think about marriage, one of the things we have to step back and look at who is in the marriage, the two parties, and we have to think about their baptismal status. In order to receive any other sacrament, a person must be baptized. So in order to receive the sacrament of marriage, the parties must be baptized. Notice the second point, which is very important. In order to receive the sacrament of marriage, both parties must be baptized. They don't have to be baptized Catholic. They must be validly Christian. They must have valid Christian baptism. This is important in the Catholic understanding because it is the two parties who give one another the sacrament of marriage, who are the ministers of the sacrament to one another. You can only receive the sacrament if you are already baptized. You can be married in the church in a Catholic ceremony, and it's not sacramental. It's still good, it's still holy, it is just one of those different things about what marriage is. So a bit of jargon. When we talk about marriage, in the canon law world, we talk about marriage being natural, that it is a bond, a union between two people. One of those people is not baptized. If it were two baptized people, it would be sacramental. If you jump to the bottom, the third point. It could be a sacramental marriage that is not celebrated in the Catholic Church. It could be a sacramental marriage between two baptized persons who themselves may not believe in the sacrament, but it's part of the way that the Church understands what marriage is, that it has these categories. Marriages can be called Catholic. A marriage celebrated in the Catholic Church is a Catholic marriage. It could be Catholic and sacramental. It could be Catholic and natural if a Catholic person marries a non-baptized person. These categories are helpful to later help us understand consequences. But the most important thing to understand is that all marriages are important in the Church. So we have the fact that marriage also exists civilly. And we have laws in our province, in our country. And this is the case in every country, that marriage exists civilly and marriage exists in the Church. In some countries, what happens in the Church also happens civilly. In Canada, it happens separately. But who follows which laws are that citizens follow the laws of their country or province. In Canada, that means citizens follow the provincial rules of marriage because marriage is ruled by the provinces. These rules can differ from the Church's understanding of marriage. Catholics are generally bound to follow both the Church's rules and the civil rules of marriage. A ceremony that is celebrated in a Catholic church is going to follow the civil rules of marriage as well. It so happens that in Canada, the minister who receives the consent of the parties, who is the minister at the ceremony, receives the people's consent in the name of the Church and in the name of the province of British Columbia. In some countries, those two ceremonies would be done separately, so that the people would marry in the church and people would marry civilly in two distinct ceremonies. In Canada, the ceremony takes place at the same time, or it can take place at the same time. So, who is bound by which laws? All citizens are bound by the laws of the country and the province where they live. Here is where it can get complicated. All people, whether they're Catholic or not, whether they're baptized or not, whether they care or not, are bound by the natural and divine laws of marriage. So when the Church looks around at everybody's marriages, it is going to apply the Church's understanding of marriage to everybody's laws, to everybody's marriages, excuse me, whether they agree or not. So we're going to be talking about the fact that marriage is lifelong. Once entered validly, the Church presumes that marriages exist, even if the parties no longer wish to be married, even if the parties believe that divorce ends their bond, because the Church is looking through its own lens. As I mentioned, baptized Roman Catholics are also bound by the laws of the Roman Catholic Church. And the classic law of that is that Catholics must marry in a ceremony recognized by the Catholic Church. And if they don't do that, the Church is not going to recognize their marriage. So sometimes ecclesiastical law will negate something that looks like a marriage took place. We'll get there. So how does marriage come into being? Over time, and the laws of the Catholic Church didn't just appear in 1983 in our Code of Canon Law. They took centuries to develop in the Church's understanding of Scripture and the Church's understanding of the different cultures it has come into contact with. The most important principle is that consent of the two people makes marriage. As I mentioned earlier, the baptism of the parties makes a marriage a sacrament. And then consummation. Notice in the parentheses, consummation is defined as sexual intercourse after consent. Doesn't matter what people do before consent. That perfects marriage. That's the language of Canon 1061. And this is particularly true when the marriage is a sacrament. What does that mean that it's perfected? It means that it is absolutely indissoluble. A marriage which is sacramental, that people have consented to and consummated, is absolutely indissoluble. And we'll get there. So consent is what brings marriage into being. Consent is done publicly in a ceremony where there are witnesses. The minimum number of witnesses is the person who receives the consent and 2 other witnesses. It's that ceremony is there originally to protect the 2 parties. It was always that consent made marriage, but if people consented privately, one person might change their mind and say, oh no, I didn't consent. The public exchange of consent makes it clear that the ceremony took place. In a Catholic ceremony, the person who receives the consent is called the official witness. Oftentimes, we talk colloquially about Father John married me. No, Father John doesn't marry anybody. He receives the consent of the 2 parties. The 2 parties marry one another in the presence of the official witness. The holiness of the ceremony comes from the fact of the baptismal status of the parties. That sacramentality is from their baptismal status, not from the venue, not from the beautiful place they're in. The beauty of those 2 people is what makes the marriage come into being and be holy. Notice in this, the official witness receives the consent in the name of the church community, recognizing that these people are now married. So Canon 1057 has 3 elements that are very important that talk about what makes a marriage come into being. These elements are all important because if one of these elements is missing, a marriage doesn't come into being. So first of all, it is the consent of both parties that makes the marriage. Doesn't matter that I consent. If the other person doesn't consent, then we don't have a marriage. In consent, and we will talk further about consent, each party must know what they're consenting to and must consent freely. On top of that, consent must be expressed in a recognized ceremony. So for a baptized Catholic, that's a Catholic ceremony. For somebody who is not baptized Catholic, that could be a civil ceremony. It has to be done in the ceremony recognized by his or her community, by their community. And the last point is a bit more complicated. Neither person is prevented by law from consenting. Both civil law and canon law has things called impediments or restrictions to marry. The easiest ones of these are people could be too young. 2 14-year-olds are not capable of marrying legally because the law won't recognize. It doesn't matter that they go through the ceremony. It doesn't matter that they say they know that what they want to do. The law will not recognize the consent they have expressed. The same is true that the law civilly and in the church won't recognize the consent of people who are too closely related by blood. A brother and a sister can't marry. A father and a daughter can't marry. An uncle and a niece can't marry because the law says that they're too close. So if they do go through a ceremony, they're prevented by the law itself. In the church, we're accustomed to knowing that people who are who have taken a vow of chastity, a religious, or priests who have promised celibacy cannot marry. They can't marry because the law restricts them, because it says they have made another promise. So even if they go through the ceremony and say the words, this law will prevent them from marrying. So each one of these three elements needs to be in place in order for the marriage to come into being. We talk about, when I said marriage coming into being, we talk about marriages and sacraments being valid or invalid. They came into being or they did not come into being. For a marriage to be valid means that it was celebrated properly according to the requirements of the law. It did come into being. And so the consent was expressed by both people, the form was correct, and there were no impediments or restrictions. Remember, into this play of affecting validity could be natural law, could be ecclesiastical law, could be divine law. An invalid marriage, when a tribunal says a marriage is invalid, it says it did not come into being at the time of that celebration. What could cause a marriage to be invalid? One of the biggest reasons a marriage could be invalid is because there's a problem with the consent of one or both parties. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the questions of tribunals in the third section. A marriage could be invalid or non-existent because the proper form was not followed. There was a ceremony, there was an exchange of consent, it was public, but if it wasn't the proper form, it won't be recognized. And a marriage can be invalid because there was an impediment or a restriction that was not dispensed. And again, here are these examples. People were underage, people were too closely related by blood. It is possible that when that impediment is there, that ecclesiastical or civil authority can let a marriage go ahead. One of the times we see this happen the most often is there is an impediment of something called disparity of cult or disparity of worship in the church. If a Catholic party wants to marry somebody who is not baptized, the church knows from its history with people that that is already going to be a relationship where there will be difficulties, where people have to learn to talk to one another about their differences in belief and in practice. And so if they go ahead and marry with that impediment, the marriage will be invalid unless that impediment is dispensed. And it does regularly get dispensed before the wedding, but that during the marriage preparation, it's a conversation that needs to happen, that both people understand that they're starting with a relationship that is going to have issues, not necessarily big issues, but that the church in its pastoral care wants to make sure that people talk about. How are they going to both take care of their faith? How are they going to deal with it when they get to their children? Questions like that. So again, if there's a problem in any of these, with consent, with the form, with possible impediments that are not dispensed, a marriage could be invalid. The one thing we haven't talked about is coming back to, we started a little bit at that first slide when we were comparing Canadian society's ideas of marriage and the church's ideas of marriage. In the church's understanding, which you can find in Canons 1055 and 1056, church speaks of the essential properties and elements of marriage. Essential means that if these are not there, there is no marriage. So you can't pick and choose these elements of marriage. Every marriage needs to have all of these essentials. That there is partnership, that there's equality between the two people, that there is openness to children and raising of children. Notice it doesn't say you have to have children. Nobody knows who can have children. God, in the natural law understanding of marriage or the divine understanding of marriage, it is that the couple says, yes, we will be open and that we will care for those children. Having children isn't sufficient. It is raising those children to be members of the society in which we live. It is for the good of both spouses, not just for the good of one. It is a relationship that is faithful, that is exclusive. You marry one person, you don't marry more than one person. It is permanent, meaning it is lifelong. And when it is between two baptized people, it is sacramental. All of these elements and properties, again, are essential. Without all of these, you cannot have a marriage. You can't get married and say, I want to be married, but we don't really care about fidelity. We don't want fidelity. No, or we don't want permanence. You have to accept all of these in the church's understanding of marriage. So we'll go from here to the first set of questions. If there are any, I'm going to switch my screen and have a moment just talking to you. I believe Sister Angela Marie will take care of the questions.
Thank you so much, Lynda, for this first part of your presentation. Yes, there are a few questions that have come in and some more that are coming. Maybe I'll start with the last. What is the difference between property and element of marriage?
I think it's just a technicality, but the essential properties, which are exclusivity, from which we get fidelity, and indissolubility, are the most important. Elements are the other things, the good of the spouses, the openness to children, also sacramentality are also in there. It's just a technical way of the law and how it looks at things.
Okay. The next is, at the time of wedding, one party is Catholic, the other one is not, but the latter got baptized years into the marriage. Mm-hmm. Does that make the marriage sacramental?
It does. It exactly does. So the two parties consent to marriage, they live in a good, holy union, and then one day the other party becomes baptized, and that the union becomes sacramental at that moment.
Very good. Okay, please explain the meaning and the process of convalidation. And maybe you'll talk about it later, but if not...
I wasn't going to talk about it, so
okay.
this would be a good time to talk about it. Okay. A Catholic party who decides to marry in a non-Catholic ceremony is in a marriage that is not recognized by the church. There are issues, there are times when people want to have their marriage recognized by the church, and so they come to the church to have that happen. And there are two different procedures how it can happen, and there are pastoral questions and sometimes questions really about what's going on with the two people. But you can have what's called a convalidation, which is actually an incorrect use of the word convalidation. But what that means is that they marry first in a ceremony not in the Catholic Church, and then they come to the Catholic Church and they want another ceremony. What's really important to understand in that is that when those two people, let's name them Mary and John, and say Mary and John got married outside the church in 2010. And then in 2020, they come to the Catholic Church and they say, we want the church to see that we're married. We want to be recognized as married in the Catholic Church. What we would call convalidation, which is incorrect, is really a marriage in the church. In the church's opinion, the Catholic one or two people were bound to marry in a Catholic ceremony. And just as an aside here, if people are in that situation, the 2010 situation, and they wanted to marry in a non-Catholic ceremony and they had good pastoral reasons for that, you could request that the church recognize your 2010 ceremony, even if it was happening in a different venue. That's possible. That's a question that's a pastoral issue that you deal with within the chancery. They won't let it happen all the time, not to marry on a beach, for instance, but there are pastoral reasons why they might let it happen. But again, the church doesn't recognize what happened outside the church. So when people come in 2020, they're marrying as if for the first time. What they're doing in the church in 2020 is not saying we've been married for 10 years. They're starting a new marriage. There is another pastoral provision, which is called a sanation, a sanatio, which heals, that's the Latin word sanatio, the consent, heals the moment of the ceremony, and goes back in time and says, yes, we recognize that you've been in a marriage since 2010. Again, there's pastoral reasons for one or for the other, but there are two different ways of solving that problem.
Very good. Lynda, I think you will speak about annulment. One of the questions is, what are the common accepted cause for annulment? So you'll get to that later. Yes. Very good. And here's another question. What will happen when the government revokes the authority of priests and deacons to grant civil marriages? Likely will happen when the government forces the Catholic Church to marry gay people. How does this square with our Catholic duty to follow the civil law?
That is a question almost above all of our pay grades. That's a question that is going to be a conversation among the bishops and the civil authorities in dealing. But what I wanted, the take-home message here is that the use of the word marriage is understood differently in different contexts. And so what the topic of tonight's talk is, how does the Catholic Church understand marriage? And right now, it understands marriage as between a man and a woman, and we could spend all night talking about that question.
Thank you. And we move to the question of children. If a couple decides before marriage not to have children, is the marriage valid?
So it depends is always going to be the answer. But remember, the church's understanding is the church's understanding of how the church thinks God wants marriage. So a couple who goes in and says, we will not have children, is going to be marrying, is not going to be expressing a valid consent. Now, that's different from saying we were hesitating, we think we'll do what God asks. He's asking you to be open. He's not asking you to have 6 children, or in the church's understanding. This is a pastoral question you need to talk about with your pastor, and you need to talk through the reasons why these are the choices that you're thinking of making.
Very good. And so a question that relates to this last is, if the decision not to have children is decided after marriage, is the marriage valid?
So consent is what makes marriage. And we'll get to this when we talk about tribunals. The tribunal is going to examine the moment of consent. If a person went in consenting and then changed their mind, it doesn't affect the consent.
Great. So we have another question. I'm a Catholic, but my spouse is not, and we married in a Catholic ceremony. Does that mean that my marriage is not a sacrament and that I can remarry without an annulment?
The answer to the second question is no. Every marriage is valued, and Catholic marriages are either sacramental or not sacramental. There's not a hierarchy. It's just important to understand that they are different. So indissolubility affects all marriages. That being said, and the last slide we'll talk about this, there are different processes that a tribunal can do, and some of which are called dissolutions, if there's a situation where a Catholic and a non-baptized person separate. Sometimes that marriage can be dissolved and not have to go through the annulment process. Going back to this person's question though, that non-Catholic, if that non-Catholic is baptized, it's a sacramental marriage. So there wasn't enough information in the question to know. If the non-Catholic is not baptized, then it is not a sacrament.
Good. This next question speaks about reception of Holy Communion. And it says, could a Catholic receive Holy Communion after divorce if it's now in a second marriage?
Okay, that's in the next section.
Oh,
so we'll get there.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
If a marriage in a Catholic church is not sacramental because one of the couple is not baptized, what is the marriage if not sacramental?
It is a Catholic marriage. So it's a natural Catholic marriage. And I'm sorry, it is just, remember, lawyers think in categories and the courts think in categories. It helps, it's not to say this is better or worse, this is just the reality. Because remember, all marriages are holy, all marriages are valuable. So what's different about a sacramental marriage? It's the kind of a grace-filled, it's a different kind of grace. And that's why the hesitation for a Catholic to marry a non-baptized person. That's where the impediment comes from. That the pastoral life of the church wants to be sure that people understand that life already has lots of ups and downs. Maybe this area of faith is an area where people have to be more careful, that's all. So should we move on to the next section and then come back to questions?
Excellent, very good. There are several questions about annulment, so you will be answering those later. So let's continue then. Thank you.
All right. So we're moving into the section talking about separation and divorce. The most important property to remember in this section is the property of indissolubility, or the permanence of marriage. The church teaches that God ordained that all marriages are a lifelong, permanent bond. So remember, all people, all marriages are lifelong. Remember, as I said, no one may change the essence of marriage, which is based on the natural or divine law. Canon 1060 says, once a marriage has been celebrated, the church presumes that it is valid until the contrary is proven. The church doesn't go around looking at people's marriages and say, oh, that's probably invalid. Oh, that's probably invalid. No, everything is presumed valid till people come to the church and have a reason to ask the church to look at the validity of their marriage. So the consequence of the teaching of indissolubility is that separation and divorce doesn't change the fact that the bond of marriage exists. If it started at consent, it continues for the life of the two people. It cannot be broken by human power. So even if a divorce happens, the church does not see that that changes the reality of the marriage that exists. So people who are separated and divorced are still married in the eyes of the church. The bond still exists, and it doesn't matter whether they think so or not. If they wanted their marriage evaluated by the church, that's how the church would see it. Just something to think about when problems do arise. What does the church say to people? First of all, it reminds people that marriage is a lifelong commitment, that marriage does involve sacrifice, that it's not a search for personal happiness. That's not a reason to say, I don't want to be here. At the same time, the church recognizes that people need to seek help, that if they're in a period of difficulty, reach out to friends, to pastors, to counselors, to professionals, Don't presume that just because that the community can't help solve problems. Sometimes it can. At the same time, the church doesn't say that if your life is terrible, if your life is unsupportable, that you're bound to stay in that relationship. The marriage may still exist, but you could leave, you could separate. So it is possible that problems can't be resolved and that separation is appropriate. So we can't say that the church doesn't permit people to separate and divorce. It does. It recognizes that there are times when, in fact, separation and divorce are appropriate responses to what's going on. But at the same time, when troubles start, and in a community, if you work in ministry, people in their early married years, you need to reach out to them, help them get through those difficult moments if they can, and help them recognize those moments when they should really end. So can Catholics separate and divorce? Sometimes yes, sometimes it's appropriate. In Canada, divorce and legal separation are the times, are the vehicles by which people do the provision for the children, the financial separation of their goods. The church doesn't do those things in Canada. So when people separate and divorce, these are appropriate vehicles to use to make sure that everybody is taken care of appropriately. We should also be thinking about how can we as church minister to people in these situations? We need to remember that they're in a very difficult situation, a person who's choosing to separate, or who spouse left them, a person who's had to choose divorce for the good of their family. We need to treat them with loving care. We need to keep them welcome in the community, them and their children. They shouldn't feel pushed out, they shouldn't feel part. How can we, and Pope Francis uses this language, how can we accompany people in their spiritual journeys to help them heal from these moments? Some questions of language that we hear that we want to be careful of. Are Catholics who are divorced excommunicated? What does it mean to be excommunicated? It means to be pushed outside the community, usually because of sinful behavior. And one thing to think about when even thinking about excommunication is that it is a means of helping somebody come back into the community. However, Catholics who are divorced are not excommunicated. There was a time, specifically in the United States, where divorce, and even more divorce and remarriage, would lead to excommunication. And Pope Paul VI ended that in the 1970s. We still hear it in our language, but it is not relevant. May Catholics who are divorced or who are separated receive communion? Here we're conflating two issues. Separation and divorce is one thing, and in itself is not sinful. Receiving communion, people receive communion people who are in a state of grace may receive communion. The fact of separation and divorce doesn't mean a person is not in a state of grace. Of course, they can continue to receive communion. Here is where the next step is where there are sometimes problems. What about a Catholic who enters a new union outside the church, whether they're living together or whether they married in a non-Catholic ceremony? Here the question of the state of grace comes up. The presumption is, it is not the fact of getting married outside the church that is the problem. It's the fact of having a sexual relationship that's the problem. That people who are married in a non-Catholic ceremony are presumed to be in a sexual relationship. And it is that when the marriage bond still exists and they're in a different bond, in a different relationship, that would mean that maybe they can't receive communion. Here, we want to be careful. We want to be open to the reasons why people are in these things. And this is a pastoral question. This is a question between this Catholic or these two Catholics and their pastor to talk about what is their situation, talk about the options. Is it an option to apply for a declaration of nullity, an annulment, and then have the marriage in the Catholic Church? If that's not an option, why not? And what are the next steps? If somebody wants to be practicing in the church, that is a journey that we accompany them on and help them through. It may not be the questions that all of us can answer, but it is certainly a question that the pastors can answer, excuse me. So Pope Francis talked about divorce in the Eucharist in his document Amoris Laetitia, number 242, which came after the 2015 Synod on the Family. He said, divorced people who have not remarried and often bear witness to marital fidelity ought to be encouraged to find in the Eucharist the nourishment they need to sustain them in their present state of life. The local community and pastors should accompany these people with solicitude, particularly when children are involved or when they are in serious financial difficulty. This accompanying people in these difficult moments of their lives is really, really important. So to summarize, legal separation and divorce are tools that people can use. They don't change how the church views the marriage. The church views that the marriage was entered, and it's going to presume that every marriage is valid, unless and until somebody comes to the church and says, could you look at the validity of my marriage? Oops, see, we just missed a slide there, excuse me. Does the church recognize divorce? It recognizes that people can get a civil divorce, especially that it addresses the issues of custody of children and financial matters. Spouses may be civilly divorced, but they're still married in the eyes of the church. And again, if people want to be considered free to marry, they must approach the Catholic tribunal and request an annulment, a declaration of nullity. So we'll go back to a few questions if I didn't address everything there, and I just need to remember how to do that. Okay, here we go. Sister?
Here I am. Okay. Let me see here. There's a question about consummation. So we go back to the previous section very briefly. And what if the marriage had not been consummated, recently married in late 2018, but not consummation yet?
So marriages can be valid because of the exchange of consent, and consummation, as I said, comes after the exchange of consent. So sexual relationship before consent doesn't consummate. So in this example, somebody marries in 2018 and they haven't consummated. It is a valid marriage. And interestingly, it may even be sacramental if both parties are baptized. But because it's not consummated, it is possible to petition the Holy Father to dissolve it. So the Holy Father has the power, because it's not absolutely indissoluble yet, to give a dissolution for a non-consummated union. And yes, he does do this. Yes, these kinds of situations do exist.
Very good. Thank you, Lynda. The next question, what are the canonical effects of the sacramentality of a marriage?
I'm not sure how to answer that. More grace, I would think. I don't know that you'd call that a canonical effect, but the grace of the sacrament is there. But other than that, it's still, both, whether it's sacramental or not, it's a valid holy marriage. Excuse me, I'm talking too much.
Very good. Is adultery, physical or emotional abuse base for annulment?
So those are different categories, but yes, but remember, marriage comes into being at the moment of consent. So somebody who marries saying, I want to be married, but I don't intend to be faithful. So it's at the moment of consent that they're reserving to themselves the right to be in an adulterous relationship. That marriage would be invalid because you can't do that. You've got to marry promising fidelity. If you marry promising fidelity and you fall prey to sinfulness and you are unfaithful, that doesn't affect the consent that you gave. So there are different ways of looking at it. Physical and emotional abuse, again, it's about how people consented. If they consented intending to be abusive, there's a problem. There's also a problem if they consented and are abusive because of mental health issues. So those mental health issues make them behave in this particular way. Again, that could be invalid. If the abuse kind of grows over time, you might have more, that might not be valid, it might be valid, but generally that would be a personality change. Like, people don't change personalities. So it's likely that that behavior was already there before. It may not have been there so strongly, but the signs probably were there. So it's one of the reasons during dating and engagement, pay attention to the signs. And when things don't brush away, things that, oh, it's probably not so bad, because things get worse when you're not on your best behavior after you're married.
Yes. Yeah. In relation to consent, what can hinder consent? What conditions in each person could make consent invalid?
We'll talk a little bit about consent in the next section. So,
all right, very good. What happens to the sacrament when a couple separates?
It still exists, like the bond exists.
Very good. And for annulled marriages with children, will the children suddenly become illegitimate?
We're going to get to that too.
All right. How much does it cost to have a marriage?
I think we better just move on.
Oh my goodness. All right, let's go down to the last part of our presentation, and then we can address those questions.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so this is the final section. So remember, all marriages are presumed valid. Canon 1060. Once a marriage has been celebrated, the church presumes that it's valid until the contrary is proven. Marriage came into being in a public way. If it's not valid, there needs to be a public recognition of that. Proof of invalidity or nullity happens through a process, through a trial run by a tribunal, which is a Latin word for court. The court process is public in the sense that it's not just in the people's minds. They bring the situation to the tribunal. What ends up being public is the fact of that a person is now free to marry. That someday you might know that you knew John and Mary from our earlier example, and then one day you see Mary getting married in a Catholic ceremony. What's public is that she must have gotten a declaration of nullity because she's now marrying in a Catholic ceremony. So you're never going to know the reasons behind the decision. The two parties will know, but only the two parties, no one else. So who would seek a declaration of nullity? Why would you want to? Anyone who believes that their marriage was not valid and who wants that to be confirmed by the church could come to the tribunal. In addition, people who would seek a declaration of nullity are people who are divorced and they want to marry in a Catholic ceremony, because the Catholic Church isn't going to permit them to marry if they're already bound by an earlier marriage. So that first marriage, they need to ask, is it possible that they could receive a declaration of invalidity? Remember, Catholic tribunals are going to evaluate marriages in light of the church's understanding of what marriage is for people of any faith. So you don't have to be Catholic to present a case to the tribunal. You could have been married to it could have been two non-baptized people in that first marriage who now either one of them wants to become a Catholic or one of them wants to marry a Catholic. And that's why they would come to the tribunal. So the only people who come to the tribunal are people who care, what does the Catholic Church think about my marriage? So in a marriage nullity case, in a marriage, the tribunal, the court uses the law of the church, uses canon law to evaluate the marriage. The person presents a request, a petition, that the tribunal examine the validity of the marriage. Without a petition, the tribunal is not going to go near it. Once the case is accepted, the tribunal processes it. Here, this is important. What is on trial? It's the validity of the marriage, not the parties, not who they are, but did a marriage come into being? In a marriage nullity case, you will get one of two answers. It's been proven that the marriage of John and Mary is invalid, and they would give a reason why, or it has not been proven that the marriage of John and Mary is invalid. A marriage tribunal would never say, this marriage is proven to be valid. They don't need to prove it. It's presumed by the law. As we saw in Canon 1060, every marriage is presumed valid. So they're just going to answer the question, is this marriage invalid? And they're going to say no or yes. It has been proven or it hasn't been proven. So what doesn't happen? The parties are not on trial. This is not an evaluation of a person being a good Catholic or a practicing Catholic or a person living an immoral life. The tribunal is going to judge actions, not to say a person is good or bad, but to say what happened. Did a marriage come into being or not? And remember, the information gathered is not publicly distributed. It is public in the sense that the final answer leads to a decision that people will know about when they see a person getting married again. But that's all. The rest of it is kept private. So the tribunal tries to get an objective understanding of what happened in this marriage. And it focuses always on the consent of the parties. So think about this. When the people come in, let's go back to John and Mary getting married in 2010. People who come to the tribunal have married, have had a common life, have separated and divorced. And so now they're looking back at what happened through the prism of knowing all the things that had happened. So the tribunal is going to try to get an understanding of how did they consent to that marriage in 2010. And it's going to try and do that through who's going to know that the best. And the people who know it the best are the two parties involved. So the tribunal is going to want to talk to and gather testimony, information from the person who requested the process, who's called the petitioner, as well as from the other party, the respondent. The tribunal is going to talk to witnesses. And in a marriage tribunal case, witnesses are going to be usually your family, your close friends, people who know you very well. And sometimes the tribunal will get evidence from doctors' reports, mental health practitioners, sometimes reports from the police, if there's been violence, different objective reports. From these different testimonies, the tribunal is going to try to come to an understanding of who the parties were in their background, what kind of families they came from, what kind of growing up did they have, how did they meet, what was their dating period like, what was their approach to marriage, and then how was the common life. So sometimes what happens after the wedding reflects back and shows us what is going on in that union. So it's a court process, as I mentioned. Generally, testimony is given orally. Interviews are done individually. So the petitioner would go by him or herself to the tribunal, would give evidence Orally, it would be taped and it would get typed out. So eventually when it goes to the judges, it will be done in writing, but the people usually give information orally. If you have friends who have gone through this process in the United States, they would mostly do it in writing. They wouldn't do oral interviews. That's just a difference of how different countries do it. But the point is that they give individual evidence. Normally, the two parties to the marriage are able to review what each other has said and what the witnesses have said. So the witnesses don't get to review the evidence, but the husband and wife do get to review. Why? So that if there's something missing, or if there's something that doesn't make sense, or someone has misremembered, they can point that out to the judges, so that by the time the information goes to the judges know the best that they can know in order to give a decision. And again, only the parties and tribunal personnel have access to the case. Why wouldn't somebody apply for a declaration of nullity? Someone who is confident that their marriage is valid might say, I don't need that. I don't need the tribunal to come to be involved because I know that I was in a marriage bond and I'm happy with that. Sometimes people around us believe that the marriage is valid, and so make us think that it wouldn't be worth going to apply for a declaration of nullity. Someone we trust says, oh no, you were married for 15 years and you had 3 children and I know it was valid. Sometimes a trusted person believes that it's your responsibility to witness to the indissolubility of marriage, to stay single, to show that you are still married. It's possible that that lines up with your own conviction, but here are things that I want to bring up because they're important to think about. Who matters in applying for an annulment is the person who is in that situation. And just because you apply doesn't mean you're going to get the tribunal is going to say the marriage is invalid. But if the question is in your heart, is my marriage valid or not, then it's worth applying. Sometimes people are embarrassed and they don't want to speak of personal matters. The interview with the tribunal is going to be very personal, to the point that some people feel that it's intrusive. People will be asked questions that they're not accustomed to answering. This is unfortunately the only way that we have to address invalidity of marriage. While it is true that it can be very hard, many people who go through this find a certain peace in getting it out, in having it heard, in getting it outside of their heart. Sometimes people fear violence from a former spouse. These situations are real. In that case, this is worth talking to the tribunal about how can they protect you, how can they protect your family. Tribunals unfortunately have experience with these things. It's worth talking to them. Sometimes you don't know where your former spouse is. Again, talk to the tribunal. They have ideas about how to find people. Here are the 2 questions Sister Angela Marie brought up. Will the children become illegitimate? No, they will not. The law itself says that in a marriage that is celebrated externally, it looks valid. Eventually somebody comes to the tribunal. Even if the tribunal says the marriage was invalid, this has a legal name called a putative marriage. It looked like a marriage, and it's only in retrospect that we know that it wasn't. And the law says the children are the children of that putative marriage. Pope Francis asked the bishops of the world to make annulments available to the faithful. And one of the areas that got in the way was cost. Tribunals cost money. They certainly do. It costs money to run the court. and to pay the people who are working in the court. So the people who are coming for an annulment are not charged right now. They're asked to think about giving a donation. And if you are thinking of giving money to Project Advance or to other things in the church, think about supporting this ministry. That if the stronger the tribunal is, the more it can help people. But if you are looking for an annulment and you cannot afford it, you will not be charged for it. So going back to those hesitations, I want to just put in people's head, don't just listen to well-meaning people who may not know about your marriage. Talk to the people who do know. The tribunal staff is there to help you. Go and talk to them. If you feel that a marriage nullity case might be appropriate, notice I don't say is certainly is appropriate, it might be. Don't be afraid to look into it. Don't guess, don't depend on people who may not know. If there's something, a voice telling you in your heart that you might want to look into it, look into it. Some potential positives of pursuing an annulment. For many people, this is the first time that they've been asked to reflect on what happened and why it happened. You can go through a separation and a divorce and never think about what went wrong and why did it go wrong and what role did I have and what role did the other person have. Facing what happened can help prevent a repeat of the same problem in the future. One of the sad facts of working in tribunal ministry is that you do see people who enter a similar relationship more than once, and they end up in the tribunal sometimes more than once. One consequence, I didn't really know where to say this, and I just wanted to put it into your head. At the end of a case, a marriage may be declared invalid. It is also possible that the judges will put what's called a prohibition or a warning on one or both of the parties, saying this person is not free to marry until they address the issues that cause the invalidity of the union. Let's say, for example, that one of the people was an alcoholic and was at the time of the wedding, and alcoholism and addiction ruined their ability to form a relationship. The judges are going to say, until that issue is dealt with, that person shouldn't be getting married again. So it is a way that pastorally the tribunal tries to help the parties move forward. Potential negatives of pursuing an annulment is that, as I mentioned, it is emotionally difficult. It can be spiritually and emotionally challenging and draining to review these parts of your life. It's not necessarily negative, but it may be that it's not the right time in your life to do that. People need to think about that. People may not be ready to face it. Pay attention. Don't do it unless it's time. Even if it's not going to be fun, you will know when it's the right time. I would counsel you not to wait until you're ready to date or ready to marry, because the process takes time. So in a sense, you need to plan ahead and think, where am I going to be in 2 years? And where am I going to be if the tribunal puts a prohibition and says, I need to work on something with myself? You don't want to be saying, I need to get married next month and approach the tribunal. And finally, you want to think about your witnesses. Witnesses can be important. And if you wait too long, your witnesses may not remember and they may not be alive anymore. And that's just a fact of life. So it's something to weigh when you're thinking about, should I apply for an annulment? If you aren't thinking about applying for an annulment, but you know somebody who is, what if someone asks you to be a witness for them? But what is your role? Witnesses help establish the context to the judges by talking about family background, talking about friendships, educational, work backgrounds. behaviors, actions. They help tell the story. Are witnesses taking sides? No. Now, in a particularly difficult separation, sometimes it may feel like you're taking sides, and you want to be clear that you're not. One way to be clear that you're not is to stick to what's objective. If the tribunal asks you, the tribunal will ask you objective, factual information. When did this happen? How did you know this was going on? For instance, how did you know that they weren't getting along? It's easy enough to say, objectively, every time I went over for dinner, they wouldn't be in the same room. You're not blaming, you're not being subjective, you're saying a fact. And that fact will help the tribunal. So think about how helpful it is to be a witness, and it can be delicate, but really you're not taking sides. So we just quickly will end thinking about consent. Reasons marriage can be invalid, mostly because of consent, or if the form wasn't properly followed, or if there were impediments that were not dispensed. Wanted to talk a little bit about what can cause invalidity of consent. We could spend 25 hours on this, so this is going to necessarily be short and sweet. But think about consent. When people consent, they consent to marriage. So they consent to all those things that are the essential properties and elements. I consent to being open to having children, to a lifetime, to fidelity, to equality, to partnership, to the good of the spouses. I also consent to marry a specific person. I don't engage in fidelity to anybody, to a generic concept of fidelity. I engage in fidelity to that person that I am choosing as my spouse. So that you need to have a certain level of knowledge of that person. So consent is going to be examined vis-a-vis that. So problems with consent can come up in terms of understanding. A person doesn't understand what marriage is or who the other person is. Maybe the other person has lied to them and is demonstrating they're somebody else. A person might want something other than marriage or the other person. So for instance, as we saw when we're talking about the essential properties, somebody who says, I want to be married, but I only want to be married as long as I'm happy, and then I'm going to leave. So then they're excluding indissolubility. You can't change the essential elements and properties. And then sometimes you have people who are not able, not capable of making a free and adult decision about marriage. They're under pressure. They're in a situation that they can't make a proper commitment, or they can't live out that commitment. So it's about the decision making or an incapacity to live out the commitment. In all of those cases, consent can be invalid. The other thing to think about here is you've got two people consenting. If one person's consent is invalid, there is no marriage. So it can be in any of those elements, but it just has to affect one person's consent. If there's a declaration of nullity or invalidity, it's a statement that says that there is proof that the marriage did not come into being, even though it looked like it did. There was a wedding. The parties lived together. They may have had children together. But in fact, at the time of the ceremony, it did not come into being. This is the legal word from Canon 1061. The law calls this a putative marriage. Invalid from the beginning, but we only know it now. We didn't know that at the time. Okay, we've already almost gone through our hour and a half, and I just wanted to highlight, we've really only talked about what the tribunal calls a formal nullity case. There are cases, different kinds of processes that deal with lack of canonical form, with undispensed impediments. You may have heard of the process that Pope Francis started before the bishop in specific cases. We alluded to the dissolutions, which end a valid bond. So it doesn't say that there was no marriage, but it just says now that the Pope gives this decision, that marriage ends. And that can happen in the case of a non-consummation or in a case where it's not sacramental, whether it's by Pauline privilege or Petrine privilege. Both of those involve people who are not baptized. So there's lots more there, but the tribunal deals with all of those things. And so that we're back at the questions. I will stop sharing. Okay, sister.
Thank you very much, Lynda. There is so much that you have shared with us tonight. Maybe a question that some people ask is in relation to the marriage tribunal. Who's part of the marriage tribunal? Who deals physically, who are these people who will decide whether or not a marriage is valid, invalid, annulled?
So the tribunal is run by a priest who's called a judicial vicar. He's Father Joseph Lee in this diocese. And he is the bishop, the archbishop's vicar, who does his judicial decision-making power. The archbishop can do some cases himself, and in these expedited cases, he does do that. Father Joseph is a canon lawyer, and he has other canon lawyers and other priests and lay people who work with him. Tribunal cases can be judged by one priest alone, or they can be judged more often by a college of 3 canonists or judges. And I think I haven't worked in the Vancouver Tribunal in many years, so in my day it was always judged by a college of 3 judges. I imagine it still is.
Very good. How many witnesses are needed for the annulment process?
They will ask for 3 or 4, but it depends on what your situation is. Maybe you don't have 3 or 4 friends or family members who are still alive. Your witnesses can live anywhere in the world. The 2 parties can live anywhere in the world. But it just depends on who knows you, who knew you, and how easy it is to get a hold of them.
Very good. Next question. My father remarried after the civil annulment. My mother is asking for a church tribunal annulment, but there is no answer from my father. Where does that put them?
So a civil annulment is different from the church annulment, but and it happens for different reasons. So the church is not going to take the civil annulment and just translate it. Excuse me. Your mother can approach the tribunal, can talk about if they reach your father and say, this is happening, do you want to participate? He doesn't have to participate. He has to be told. And if he chooses not to participate, that's his own business. If he can't be found, the tribunal can try to help find him, to tell him. It's his right to know that it's happening.
Yeah. And is infidelity during marriage a cause for annulment or separation?
Infidelity is only a cause for a declaration of nullity if it was an issue from the beginning, from the time of consent. Although sometimes infidelity is showing that somebody who's choosing to be unfaithful repeatedly at different times might be making choices for his or her own good, so choices against the good of the spouses. But then you'd have to show that those choices were always in that person's approach to the world. It's possible. But the fact is that infidelity is often just the result of sinful behavior in people's lives. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the marriage is invalid.
Okay, this is a scenario. A couple goes through all the pre-marriage course, and in a few days before the marriage, the priest says, I'm not going to give you a sacramental marriage, only a civil marriage. And then he ends up not even registering the marriage in the church records. Can a priest refuse these 2 Catholic baptized people a sacramental marriage?
Okay, first of all, the parties give the sacrament to themselves. It's nothing to do with the priest. So, and he is obliged to give them the Catholic in Canada, he has to do the Catholic ceremony and the civil ceremony at the same time if they're both free. Now, sometimes if they were already civilly married, they could come to the church and have the Catholic ceremony. He would only do the Catholic ceremony then because they already have a civil wedding. But generally, the priest is the minister of both ceremonies at the same time. And generally speaking, he can't separate those ceremonies. So he oughtn't and shouldn't, and you should be complaining to somebody if that's happening.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And then do we need the both spouses to apply for the annulment or the consent of both?
No. One person can apply. The other person must be told, but they don't have to participate.
Very good. And can you please explain the Pauline privilege and the Petrine privilege?
They're privileges that come from St. Paul and many centuries of interpretation, but basically the Pauline privilege takes place in the diocese and it involves two non-baptized people. Now, one of them wants to be baptized and marry in the Catholic Church. They don't have to be Catholic. They don't have to become Catholic. And the privilege dissolves that non-sacramental marriage for the Catholic wedding that's coming, and it takes place in the diocese. It's very specific. If your facts fit it, it's like you fit into it like a glove. And if you don't fit it, you can't do it. A Petrine privilege is granted by the Pope through the chair of Peter, and it involves at least one non-baptized person in order for a Catholic person to marry in the church. It's a privilege granted to that Catholic to marry in a Catholic ceremony. And both of these cases are dissolutions of non-sacramental unions. So they're indissoluble, but on a level not absolutely indissoluble. And so there are these very specific times. And these two things are the only times where the tribunal cares about your behavior. That if the person who is applying for the privilege has behaved in an immoral way, the Pope won't grant the privilege. So basically, if a marriage ends because one party is unfaithful and now wants to marry the person with whom he was or she was unfaithful, you won't be able to get the privilege. It's the only time where that moral behavior matters in a tribunal situation.
Very good. Okay, a few more questions. We're right at the end of our evening together. How does the church recognize common law partners?
So it goes back to your baptismal status. So if you're Catholic and you're living common law, it doesn't matter, then it's just as though you're living in a civil union. It's recognized by the state, but it's not recognized by the church. But more complicated is if you're not baptized, or if you're baptized in a Christian denomination that recognizes the civil law jurisdiction, then it's going to be considered a marriage because it's considered a marriage by the province.
Very good. If the ex-spouse has remarried in civil court, could that help in the annulment process?
It doesn't matter one way or the other. It's just a fact.
And can you speak about the process of remarriage after the annulment is granted?
So the first thing is, did the tribunal put a warning or a prohibition against the person who wants to get married? And if so, are they recommending counseling? What are they recommending that you address? And it's not punitive. It's there in a pastoral sense to say, we're worried that this looks like you haven't addressed this, and we don't want to see the same problem in another union. Otherwise, that new union you would approach like anybody getting married in the church.
Very good, Lynda. I think we're at the end of our time together. Many, many questions, and we apologize for those questions that we have not been able to answer. Hopefully, we can talk about the topic again. But thank you so much for your expertise and for your passion and for helping us understand the process of annulment and what truly a Catholic marriage is like, and how we should be preparing ourselves to enter the sacrament, and also what we should be aware if things don't go well. And thank you for your pastoral approach also. It's been very, very helpful. So some people in the chat box have asked, how do we go about, who do we contact? So I said the tribunal here in Vancouver, obviously the Archdiocese. Please call the Archdiocesan Center and ask for someone at the marriage tribunal. And so do not hesitate if you have any questions, as Lynda suggested. And most recently, the Archdiocese has also launched a new ministry to divorce and separated, and has been providing the opportunity for divorced and separated Catholics to really experience the church as a place of healing and to be welcomed as an essential part of the faith community. So here are some upcoming events that they're offered as means of accompaniment and support and community. So please, if you're interested, you can go on our Behold website and register for this upcoming events. And again, we thank Lynda for her time with us tonight, and please come back with us next month. Into the Deep, from a bi-monthly series, has now become a monthly series. So next, our next event will be with Father Horgan. Father Horgan will be sharing about the life of two wonderful men, an Italian young boy, Carlo Acutis, a teenager who died of leukemia. Carlo was best known for documenting Eucharistic miracles around the world. And he did a lot of work through media. He created a website, and he's going to be canonized on October 10th. And then Father Michael McGivney, an American priest based in New Haven, Connecticut. And Father McGivney, as you probably well know, founded the Knights of Columbus, a local, beautiful priest who served many, many people, and whose legacy is still among us with the Knights of Columbus. So Father will speak about these two men and their legacy in our church, and also a little bit about the process of canonization. So many questions about how men and women become saints after their deaths. So Father Horgan is an expert on that. So we hope that many of you can join us on October 23rd to celebrate the inspiring lives of these two men. And so thank you again to Lynda Robitaille tonight, and thank you to all of you for attending. May God bless you and keep you always. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you, Lynda.